So, if you are new to these programs, my name is Jane O'Neill. I own the company Culturally Curious. I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this one. And like I said, you're in for a treat tonight because Jacob Lawrence's work is just so I think astonishing to behold and really rewarding to spend time with and kind of unpack together. So, let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our time together. And again, welcome to those of you who are just joining us. I'm sorry for the little delay tonight, just a technical hiccup, but I'm happy to be with you, and I'm so happy you're with me. So, tonight, Jacob Lawrence, here's how we're going to move through this material. We're going to get started with an introduction to the artist. We saw his self portrait on the title slide. This is another self portrait right here. He's up in his attic studio that he had towards the end of his life, which really just seemed like such a colorful, really vibrant place. We'll see some photos of it as well. From the introduction to the artist, we will move on to his groundbreaking early work, which is the Migration series. And I think if you're not already familiar with it, you will find that this is such a moving series of images. From there, we will look at the way Jacob Lawrence so effectively captured the rhythm of life in Harlem. And then we are right there in the middle of World War II, and Jacob Lawrence served. We'll see how his time in the service impacted and influenced his art. And then we'll turn our attention to one of his only recently kind of rediscovered series, in that these works were brought together and exhibited within the past 6 years or so. But it's sort of a lesser known series for him. It's kind of challenging to look at, but I think he's striving for great things there. We will wrap up with his legacy, some of his later works, and then conclude from there. So, as always, so much to cover. Let's see if we can do this in, a nice tight hour, right? Let's see. We're going to get started with an introduction to Jacob Lawrence. And I love a good baby picture. This is Jacob Lawrence all the way over here on the far left in a family photo. He was born in Atlantic City in 1917, and he had, I would say, a pretty tough childhood in that his parents had migrated up from the South. They were sort of recent transplants to the North, and their marriage didn't survive. When he was only about 6 or 7 years old, his parents split up, and his mother was unable to care for the children. And so they were put into foster care in Pennsylvania. So there was a significant division from his parents. And it wasn't until he was about 13 that he was reunited with his mom in the community of Harlem. Now, at that time, you can tell that his mother was doing her best to get him connected to artistic resources. From a young age, this artist had showed an interest in pattern and in color. He used to lie on their living room rug and try to recreate the pattern with his crayons. So she enrolled him in the Utopia Children's House, which we can see over here, which had sort of like an after-school arts program. And then young Jacob Lawrence started doing something sort of surprising. He started visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there were so many works there that really spoke to him. And what we'll see, and I just wanted to sort of review this sort of quickly, because you're going to see that this artist was able to fuse together all of these different influences to create something that was distinctly his own. Now, he said he loved the old masters. So when he went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he was probably looking at works by like Giotto and by Bruegel. And Giotto, who was painting in the 1300s, one of the things that he's best known for was that he painted in tempera paint, which, dries sort of matte. It's a more challenging medium than, say, oil paint. Well, that's the medium that Jacob Lawrence would adopt in adulthood too. And we can see the kind of quality of color that you can produce with tempera paint like this. Now, looking at a work like this one by Bruegel down below, it's an image of peasant life. That's what Bruegel specialized in, these kind of genre scenes, slice of life. We can see peasants relaxing during the harvest. And certainly Jacob Lawrence is going to focus on working class people for so much of his career. He wants to tell the story of everyday people. He also loved the modern masters, including Vincent van Gogh and Henri Matisse. And if you look at the Van Gogh here, again, the vibrant colors, the real interest in color theory there, these great abstracted patterns here as well. This is all going to be seen in Jacob Lawrence's work. And when we look at the Matisse sculpture, I mean, this figure is going to be everywhere in Jacob Lawrence's work. It's an abstracted human form, and it's also like a dark silhouette, right? So this is what he sort of trains himself to do, is to make these really expressive figures that are abstractions, so similar to what we see Matisse doing in the early part of the 20th century. Now, there's one last element of the Met's collection that had a huge impact on young Jacob Lawrence, and that was their collection of ancient Egyptian relief carvings. And the most significant part of this is that it was sequential storytelling. And we'll see Jacob Lawrence take that on as his mode of expression for essentially his entire life. We'll see what that looked like as well. So he's getting this education from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And in addition to that, as through his teen years, he begins to take classes at a place called the Harlem Art Workshop. And this wasn't just any old after school program. He was really being taught by the best of the best in Harlem. We have over here on the left the artist Charles Alston. We can see an example of his work in the back. And then an artist that we've spent some time with in the past before, Augusta Savage, preeminent Black sculptor from the time. Sort of like luminaries in the Harlem Renaissance. So, what this means is that young Jacob Lawrence was receiving like the best artistic education you could from really the first class of professional Black artists in the United States. So it was a particular opportunity, like a right time, right place. Now, in these next images here, we can see this is Jacob Lawrence, second from the left in the photo on the left. Here he is working at the Harlem Arts Workshop. And he continues to go there. He continues to kind of take in everything they have to offer. But when he's just 16 years old, Jacob Lawrence has to he has to leave formal schooling. He has to drop out of high school because it's the middle of the Great Depression and his family has no money. So he has to work to help to support his family. He's delivering newspapers, he's delivering laundry. And he talked about how he like basically just waited all day. He pined away for that chance to finish his work, the jobs that paid, so that he could get back to these creative spaces. Now, after he sort of aged out of the Harlem Arts Workshop, he began to rent just a corner of of space in his art teacher's studio. So that would be Charles Alston. And this is in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance. And some of the greatest thinkers, some of the most creative people, Langston Hughes, Alan Locke, Richard Wright, are coming through this studio, are interacting with his teacher, presumably interacting with him to a certain extent. And they are talking about our ideas around art and ideas about what it means to be Black in America. This was like a master class on how to create art that spoke to your community, that represented your community. So in addition to that incredible education that he was getting, you can imagine him just sitting in that corner soaking it all up like a sponge. Jacob Lawrence was also going to the library. This is a man that did his research, and I think you can tell, you will see from his series that he reveled in this, that he really enjoyed the kind of fact finding that was involved in doing this research. So he's not pictured in this image over here on the left, but this is an image that's roughly contemporary. Jacob Lawrence was going to the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, which had a particularly strong collection in Black historical documents. So a lot of material culture from like the 19th century. And here he is taking it all in. It's informing his work. That particular library would then go on to become the Schomburg Center for Black Culture because of the strengths of those collections. And because of these very rich and rewarding experiences Jacob Lawrence had in that library, he would depict libraries in his art throughout his career. It's important to note that when he was going to school, when he was in high school, before he had to leave, um, he recognized that there wasn't any facet really of Black history that was being taught, and he recognized that as like a void, as a deficit that existed, and libraries, particularly this library branch, filled in what was such a big gap for him in his life and in his education. So what happens from there? Young Jacob Lawrence, right around the age of 20, starts making these series of works focused on Black history. Now, it's still the Great Depression. There's some money coming in from the WPA, from the Works Progress Administration, but there isn't enough money to, say, fund a young, unknown Black artist to like make a mural. So these series were sort of like an alternative route to depicting Black history. So he did a series on Frederick Douglass. He did a series on Harriet Tubman. And what I have here on the screen, of course, is young Jacob Lawrence. And right next to him is an image from that Harriet Tubman series that he did. And I want to kind of stay with this image for just a moment, just so that we can really look at and appreciate what Jacob Lawrence was doing at such a young age. Now, I mentioned before, he was able to sort of synthesize all these different influences. And I mean, you see the Van Gogh colors, you see the abstractions of Matisse, you see the interest in labor and working people, and all of this is done with that tempera that I mentioned. And here he is committing all of this to a cycle, to a series, very similar to what he saw with those ancient Egyptian relief carvings. So, what of this Harriet Tubman? This is such a powerful image. We're going to stay with it for just a second. And I will preface our examination here with the fact that by synthesizing all of these things, Jacob Lawrence realized that he was creating something new. And he actually had a name for what he was doing. He called it dynamic cubism. Sometimes he called it expressionism. But essentially, he's taking like some European modern influences and he's activating them. He's bringing in Black culture to that too. So let's take a look at Harriet Tubman here. This is an image that, like I said, it's worth spending some time with. I want to just draw your attention to the fact that Harriet Tubman is here sawing what looks like a log on a sawhorse here. And it's a deceptive image because I think you have to look a little long and hard before you realize that her knee is up on that log. You can sort of see her foot kind of coming off to the side behind her. So if we think about it, her body is sort of receding away from us in depth at an angle. But Jacob Lawrence has completely flattened her out here, and the pattern of her skirt has flattened her out here. He pushes the vision of her arms forward, and they look just like that abstracted Matisse sculpture, don't they? They're incredibly powerful. They're simplified, and they speak to the force, the labor that is taking place in this scene. Now, in addition to this, there are these suggestions and strong diagonals, suggestions of diagonals and strong diagonals. So we have this one line from the log that she is sawing, and then another line from this landscape here. And we can almost imagine those lines extending out beyond the frame of the picture and sort of coming out to this triangle here. So even if it doesn't overwhelm you at first, there are these strong diagonals. And then one additional diagonal with the slope of her shoulders. She's got these very broad, very powerful shoulders. Note that her head is sort of almost lowered all the way in between them as she's focusing on this work. And so we have this one jagged, sort of angular shoulder blade that is coming out and breaking that tilted horizon line there. So we're focusing on activating the scene through a lot of these powerful diagonals, and we are flattening so much of the scene at the same time and focusing on storytelling with a very expressive figure here with a simple color palette. It's all done really well. And I think there's like all these very smart, subtle things that are happening in this work that that make it surprising that such a young person did it. And like I said, he had a breakthrough moment right in his early 20s. We will, of course, be looking at the migration series together. This is just a little preview of it. But by the time he had finished that work, he had national fame. We'll talk about how he gets there. And on the heels of that professional success, Jacob Lawrence has personal success too. He gets married to a fellow artist, Gwendolyn Knight, and she was also a student of Augusta Savage. So probably met and fell in love in the studio. And even though Gwendolyn Knight had her own success as an artist, she also worked with Jacob Lawrence and supported much of what he did in terms of research, in terms of um, sort of simplifying language for the captions or the titles of his work, which I think are in many ways just as important as the visuals. Now, in the visuals that we have here, we can see him alongside his bride wearing a Coast Guard uniform. So that's our reminder that Jacob Lawrence does go to war. We'll be looking at his war experience, at least through a couple of images. When he returns home a few years later, Jacob Lawrence is struggling with mental illness, and he is actually hospitalized for about 11 months. Um, while he was there, he's an artist. He did what he knew. He made a series about mental illness. This is a work that's simply called Depression. We can see these kind of muted tones in the walls here. He showed people going to therapy, like group therapy and art therapy. In an image like this, we can see, a state of sadness and paralysis here that is well, it reaches out to you. It makes sense. It's visceral, right? We understand how strong how strong these feelings are when we look at an image like this. And this series from the hospital was met with critical acclaim too. The critics in particular, really liked what he produced. So going into the 1950s and 60s and 70s, there's so much cultural and political upheaval in the United States. And Jacob Lawrence did not shy away from that in terms of content for his artwork and inspiration for his artwork. The image over here on the left is called The Ordeal of Alice from 1963. And in some ways, I think of this as like a counterpoint to Norman Rockwell's image of, the problem we all live with in school desegregation. It's in no way romanticized by Jacob Lawrence. He shows a black girl in a white dress who's suffering the slings and arrows, essentially, of these tormentors around her. And she's pierced literally by all these arrows as though she's Saint Stephen here. And we see all of these ghoulish figures that are not depicted as white people per se, but more as like something terrifying and demonic here. So, so some of these images can be difficult to look at. They're not necessarily traditionally beautiful, but they are dealing with such tough subjects in, I think, such profound and smart ways. Over here on the right, we have an image called Confrontation at the Bridge. This was created on the 10-year anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when the civil rights marchers who were leaving Selma to go to Montgomery to to essentially advocate for civil rights, for voting rights, are crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge and come into conflict with the state troopers that were on the other side of the bridge, who then brutalized the peaceful protesters. Jacob Lawrence shows those marchers as a unified group here, as a peaceful group. We see smiling faces, and he represents that state violence as just the snarling, wolf like dog on the other side of the bridge. Notice, too, it's an uphill battle here. So he finds poetic ways sometimes to share that struggle, to share the terror and the sadness that's all wrapped up in some of the most devastating stories from the civil rights movement. Now, in for many years, Jacob Lawrence worked as a professional educator. He had taught at the Pratt Institute. He had a role at Brandeis University for some time. But in 1970, he and his wife moved across the country all the way to Seattle for a teaching position for him at the University of Washington. And he worked and taught there for about 15 years and touched probably hundreds, if not thousands, of lives of his students. We can see him here in that attic studio that we'd sort of glimpsed before during one of those self-portraits. So when all was said and done, like I said, Jacob Lawrence had a 6 decade long career, and it broke all kinds of barriers for Black artists. What we are going to do now together is to go back to the beginning to really see how he launched himself. And it is with that migration series, which you can easily say is a visual epic. It's worth noting, too, that that his arrival in New York City was the result of a migration, right? His parents had moved up north. And if you trace any one of our family histories back, there's probably a story of a migration in our own families as well. So this is an epic that is inspired by and seeks to sort of document the specific migration of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial North, beginning around 1916. And of course, all of this happened not as a result of slavery per se, but because of the inequalities of Jim Crow laws, the rising tide of racial violence, the widespread disenfranchisement, and the horrible cycles of poverty that existed, that people could not free themselves from in the South. So you have multiple waves of migration throughout the 20th century. But at the time that Jacob Lawrence created this series, 1.6 African Americans had moved north by that time. When the entire Great Migration was done in around 1970, about 6 million people had left the South for northern cities. So that's what the Great Migration is all about. Just to remind you, Jacob Lawrence was so young when he created this series. He was just 23 when he started this ambitious project. And again, remember, the idea of a series is sort of because he couldn't do murals, right? There wasn't funding for that. There wasn't the same kind of opportunities, but he could work on these kind of small sheets and tell a story that way. So there's 60 of these panels all together. By this time, he has a grant, he's got some funding, he's got his own studio, and he does something that is really smart, but also shows you how methodical he was. He'd take an individual color and use it on each one of those 60 panels and then sort of like move on to the next color so that his colors throughout the series could be as consistent as possible. And, to have 60 of anything in any room, you can imagine that, there's some space issues. There's some space issues even for us as viewers when you go to see this work. It takes up a lot of space in a gallery, and it actually sort of forces you, the viewer, to go on your own journey, right? Because you have to move from image to image to image. There are like natural stopping points within the series, but you go on a journey too. We can see from the installation shots here that the actual images themselves are very modestly sized. They're about 12 by 18. So they're intimate. I mean, you need to be right in front of them to fully appreciate each one. The last thing that I wanted to note before we start looking at these images together is that there's a great deal of repetition throughout, not just that, that same color that you see sort of punctuating so many of these scenes. Like just in this picture, you can see the same kind of red, the same pop of yellow. So these sorts of things move your eye around, but there are also these very strong diagonals, that dynamic cubism, right? The flattening of form, certainly, and the repetition of things like bars, staircases, luggage, ladders, we'll see again and again. And it creates this sort of musical like rhythm that keeps you moving throughout the entire series. Now, we're not going to go through all 60 of them just in the interest of time tonight. There is a wonderful video online from Smart History that's about 10 or 12 minutes long, and they take you through each image and they read the caption of each image, and it's very powerful. I've sort of, no, not to do any sort of disservice to Jacob Lawrence, but I've sort of shuffled it around a little bit, and and in the interest of time, I'm trying to show you sort of some of the most impactful scenes tonight. We're going to start with that first panel, which I know we've looked at in some other programs too, but this is just getting us going, right? We have that first scene of people leaving the South. There's a crush of people at this train station. We see the cities that they are leaving on. We see that these are anonymous figures. There's no individualized faces. They are essentially silhouettes with brown skin here. So this is not the story of a specific person. This isn't one family's journey. This is something that is supposed to feel like it's universal. It's part of the Black experience, that anyone could see themselves or their family story being depicted here. We also have some pretty subtle but definitely present strong diagonals that are organizing this composition. A limited color palette. Again, he's just using these little pops of color to create this visual interest in this crush of people here. So Jacob Lawrence throughout this series sort of sprinkles in some images and some text that speak to why people were leaving the South. And of course, I've already mentioned some things like the violence, the poverty, these things. I want to show you how he depicts them, um, and how powerful even the most simple composition could be. So some of these are a little bit out of sequence, but the first one here at the top left is number 17. The caption is, "The migration was spurred on by the treatment of the tenant farmers by the planter." So again, there's this inequality in terms of work and a cycle of poverty in terms of farming in the South. And so we can see that dynamic kind of set up with the Black laborers here who have these heavy sacks on their back, who are being essentially shortchanged by this white man on the right side of the composition. Over here on the right, the top right, this is an image that always moves me. This is number 24, and the caption is, "Their children were forced to work in the fields. They could not go to school." And there's just something about not feeling hope for the next generation that I think is just, it's so soul crushing, right? To look at your children and to know that they're not going to have a better life, that they're not going to, that they cannot advance themselves with, and they cannot get an education. So we have these like half naked children in this scene who are, are laboring. They're doing this difficult work, holding things over their heads and struggling to lift these baskets here. So again, told with the economy of detail, but sometimes the words and the visuals together can just ignite something so powerful in you as the viewer. Down here on the lower left, this is number 10, and the caption, so simple, is just, "They were very poor." And if you think about wanting to show that, what would that look like anyways? It would look like an empty table, right? Empty plates, empty bowls, and um, and the weight and of of worrying about how you're going to survive with so little that's suggested in such a simple composition as the one that we see here. We can even see sort of like these repetitions of forms among just the images that we're looking at here. And then finally, over here on the lower right, number 22, the caption is another of the social causes of the migrants leaving was that at times they did not feel safe, or it was not the best thing to be found on the streets late at night. They were arrested on the slightest provocation. Um, just fearing for your own safety, worrying that you could be arrested by an unjust legal system. So we have these three figures that we see from behind. Again, these high slumped shoulders, the heads kind of hanging low, and they are cuffed to each other with these bright yellow shackles. Um, so, that are just so limiting, right? That's exactly where your eye goes. We can see the bars in the background, the suggestion of a jail cell sort of echoed in the stripes of the pants here. It's a simple composition, but it certainly speaks to the kind of abuses that Black individuals suffered living in the South at this time. Now, there's one more image that I want to share with you, and it's a strong one. It's a lot to take on. The caption for this one is simply "There were lynchings," number 15. And again, Jacob Lawrence is so measured in what he shows us. He doesn't show us a body. There's nothing gratuitous here, but he shows us a branch and he shows us a rope. And then he shows us this little tiny person who is sitting on a rock and his hunched over in grief, maybe in terror. You can only begin to imagine what they're feeling, what they've seen. Certainly, if you've been through something like that, you're going to think of leaving this place, right? Um, this is all suggested with so few colors, so few lines, this strong diagonal that leads our eye up to this figure here. So then he begins to show us things starting to change and people thinking about leaving. I love this composition. This is a daydream. This is somebody lying in bed and we're at the head of their bed. And he gives us this kind of wild perspective where the bed sort of gets wider as it goes off into depth. This is number 33. And the caption is people who had not yet come north received letters from their relatives telling them of the better conditions that existed in the North. Imagine what it would feel like to lie in your bed and to read those letters and to start wondering about for yourself. Maybe there's a child next to you. Maybe that child has been suffering. Maybe that child has heard that letter and you're all beginning to think. Note the use of the yellow here too. It functions as like a wallpaper or something here, but it's also like those prison bars that we were just looking at. I really love this next image. It somehow reminds me of like a little diorama looking into this box. Number 30, in every home, people who had not gone north met and tried to decide if they should go north or not. What are those conversations like? There's nothing here to distract you, the visitor, from thinking about those conversations. And there's really, I mean, there's not much to suggest that there's um, a lot to hold on to in the present circumstances, but there's so much at stake, right? I mean, how do you leave everything you've ever known for the hope that something could be better someplace else? That's such a big decision to make. And again, these figures are drawn in such a simple way, but there's something so elegant in the way he's composed these bodies, that feeling of being crowded around this table, of having that conversation. We glimpsed this work before. This is just called The Migration Gained in Momentum. And we can see these two groups that look like they are about to kind of merge. We've got this strong diagonal leading our eye up the page, really, like up the composition in this case. We've got that limited color palette that, again, moves our eye within this mass of people. And we can see that, they're walking with everything that they own. They're willing to take that risk. And this next work is so startling. Jacob Lawrence shows what they've left behind. Number 13, the crops were left to dry and rot. There was no one to tend them. So we have this I love this. It's like a radical modernist composition here, the way he's fragmenting the light. Um, and then this fascinating landscape with these different like ribbons of color kind of moving through it. And then this almost like ethereal giant bird-like cloud in the sky. It's just a beautiful image, isn't it? But he's showing us the stakes here now. The South is going to change, and the South now has a vested interest in keeping their cheap labor in the South. So we Jacob Lawrence shows that the efforts that were made to try and keep the Black population in the South. And that happened through threats, intimidations, mass arrests, and just, forgive the pun, derailing people's travel plans. So on the left here, we have a work, number 12. The railroad stations were at times so crowded with people leaving that special guards had to be called in to keep order. He sets those guards apart. In the foreground, they have these kind of brutish, thuggish faces. They've got a different color palette, right? And we can see the migrants just going about their business. They are certainly not looking for conflict. They are just trying to leave. And we see these guards interfering with that in this image on the right to make it difficult for the migrants to leave. They were arrested en masse. They often missed their train. And so we have a guard entering a train car here. We see these people with their heads bound or bowed, uh, trying not to make trouble, get into trouble. They're trying to avoid it at all costs. Look at this. It looks like the figure of a child who's wrapped his arms around a parent's lap and is, obscuring his head here. But you can tell from the posture of this guard that they're there to make trouble, right? They're trying to disrupt this. Jacob Lawrence gives us the image of this train traveling through the night. And this is an early image. It's number 5. And the caption is, "The migrants were advanced passage on the railroads paid for by Northern industry." Northern industry was to be repaid by the migrants out of their future wages. So, so he makes it clear that all is not perfect in the North. To leave for many people was essentially signing up for a different kind of indentured servitude. There was uncertainty there. But he does show a sense of relief, a sense of joy as the migrants begin to arrive. This is called "The Migrants Arrived in Great Numbers." And we see like those bowed heads that we saw before, they're starting to lift up. We see this little child here who's like beginning to swing the package that's under his arm. There's there's a sense of hope and promise in the air now. But Jacob Lawrence makes it clear that not everything is perfect in the North. And now we have 2 vertically oriented works. So these are sort of like places to pause, right? You're like moving along, moving along. And what do we see here? He is giving us an image of voting in the North over on the left. And of course, that was a right that was denied to the Black population in the South. So there's that sense of like, okay, now we have this right, but alongside it is a police officer with a club in his hand. There's still threats and intimidation that are happening along with this, but also people determined to exercise that right. Over here on the right side of the screen, we have an image, number 49. They found discrimination in the North. It was a different kind. And so, of course, we're looking at a segregated restaurant. And on the left, we have white diners. On the right, we have black diners. We can see some disparity in terms of how they're being served, how they're being treated. And again, the simple, humble determination here to just exist, to persist on, and a sense of maybe entitlement or disgruntlement on the faces of these white diners. And, I love this beautiful yellow that he's using is like this pop of color. And here it's this rope that separates these two groups for, of course, what we know are such meaningless reasons. I always like to wrap things up on a happy note. Uh, so we're going to end our look at the Great Migration or the Migration series with this comparison here. One of the last images from the series is this one. I think this is 58 over here on the right. So we'd seen before that there had been no hope for children when living in the South, that they were essentially condemned to like this life of servitude. And in the North, as the series is winding up, we have three little girls wearing dresses in a schoolroom, and each one of them is writing a number on the chalkboard. And each one of them, as our eyes move across, is reaching ever higher. It's just that, like, these are such simple distinctions from one image to the next, but so significant too. Fully clothed children getting their education, aspiring to a better life, and then that hope, that sense of hope that you get when you see your children um, making their way in the world and hopefully being able to thrive in the world. So, what happened with this series, with this remarkable series? Well, we can see it here. It was installed in this gallery in New York City. Um, this was in 1941, 1942. And again, Jacob Lawrence is practically a baby at this point, right? He's in his early 20s. Now, what's so amazing about this is that he was the first Black artist in America to get gallery representation in New York City like this. So this was a big deal. And in addition to representing the works, and Jacob Lawrence, his gallerist, was also helping him with marketing and got him a significant spread in Fortune magazine. It featured his picture. It featured reproductions of 16 works from the Migration series. All of a sudden, Jacob Lawrence is a national story, and museums started clamoring for this series. In fact, it was MoMA and the Phillips collection down in DC. They both wanted to buy the whole thing. In the end, they decided that they'd just split it. And one institution took all the even numbers, one institution took all the odd numbers. So he has arrived at such a young age. Where do you go from there, right? I mean, you could just relax, rest on your laurels. But Jacob Lawrence was an artist through and through. And so in the 1940s, after the success of the Migration series, he really starts dedicating himself to portraying the community that raised him, the community that he knew and loved so well. This is a 1942 painting called Harlem Scene. Whenever I look at it, it reminds me sort of like a Dutch Baroque genre scene, because we get all of these details of life in Harlem at this time, all these tiny little figures interacting on the street, this kind of flattened perspective here with the strong diagonal taking our eye back. We have children jumping rope. We have people playing checkers. We have this leaping dog here on a leash. A little bit further up the sidewalk, we can see people who are moving a piano up the side of this tenement building to get it into somebody's apartment. We see laundry being dried on the roof. We see this big dramatic church here on the right side. So there's so much to kind of delight in. I mean, there's like a fruit cart here or a vegetable cart that's being drawn by a horse. There's great details and so much energy to this. We can see in the space of about a year, he, I think, really advances his depiction of Harlem. And now he is using brighter colors. I think he's kind of reduced his color palette down. He's emphasizing more the abstract shapes and forms. It's less about doing an exact tenement or an exact city block and more about showing like these stacked buildings, one on top of the next. Look at how he stylizes and repeats the visual of all of these fire escapes here too. So this is called This is Harlem. And he's drawing really interesting associations with all of the flat signage too, right? I mean, the picture itself is flattened out. We get a little bit of perspective over here, but we have things like a funeral home on one side, a beauty shop on the other. We've got a bar versus a church over here. So, I mean, he's giving us like this full sweep of life. It's giving us like vice and virtue. There's so much happening here, and it's all animated with like these delightful colors with these unexpected abstractions throughout. So Jacob Lawrence is on a roll. It's around the mid 1940s. In 1942, we see this work here, Tombstones from the Whitney Museum of Art. And this is one of his most famous works. And what we see, this is sort of similar to the work that we just saw, but on a smaller scale. We see a little shop front under the sort of like below street level here, and it's for tombstones. It's this big, profound reminder of where we're all going to end up, right? It's a dark subject matter. And on either side, he frames that with babies, a woman with a babe in her arms, a child in a stroller here, and again, we've got like this pyramidal composition here with our eyes just moving around, thinking about beginnings, thinking about ends. And then we can ascend up this staircase here and just go about living our regular lives while continue to begin and end all around us. There's like the full sweep of humanity here. It really is something, isn't it? He loves the idea of giving us like a little peek at Harlem by just depicting a sidewalk scene like the ones that we see here. These are also from the early 1940s. We've got barbecue over here on the left and on the right. This work's called There Are Many Churches in Harlem. The People Are Very Religious. So in each of these scenes, we can sort of peek into these establishments and see what's happening. People at lunch counters, people at a church service, one with their hands standing with their hands raised up, and we can see the preacher in the back underneath a sign that says God, God, God. Um, but we're also still out on the sidewalk. We see people moving about their daily business, and we also see people who are stopped in their tracks, being pulled in by God or by the amazing smell of barbecue, right? Smelling all that cooked meat that we can see through this open window. Over here on the right, the window is this fantastic abstract design. This is a storefront that has been sort of appropriated for into a church space. So he's giving us, all of this like vibrant energy. Just look too in both of these scenes as you look through these doorways, there's like a light fixture hanging down at a strange angle. He just kind of activates things in wonderful little ways throughout. As the decade goes on, he starts kind of zooming in on individual figures. It's less about street scenes and more about people. He's not interested in making portraits per se, but he wants to show work. He wants to show labor. He wants to show the dignity of work as well. So we have the seamstress over here on the left, and on the right, we have the barber shop and several barbers at work here. So by doing this, by making this shift, he is sort of insisting that the true story of Black America is that these people are living ordinary lives, and earning their income with the skill of their hands, and they are sustaining their community in the process. This is like we're all in it together with, through our daily labor kind of feeling here. We're going to end our look at Harlem with these last two scenes here, and these scenes become recurring themes in Jacob Lawrence's body of work. On the left, we have an image called The Cabinet Makers. It's sort of like these construction scenes that Jacob Lawrence becomes sort of fascinated with throughout his career. This is the first time we see people who are, working with wood and measuring things. These cabinet makers actually shared some studio space with him when he was in that corner in Charles Alston's studio. And he was fascinated by how they all ran around and got work done and collaborated together. So we've got this great sort of X composition here, and the dynamism of these bodies at work is just so wonderful. Over here is his very first library painting, and he simply called it The Libraries Are Appreciated. It's a pretty straightforward composition, but look how he animates it by including this bookshelf here that is receding back into depth at like this downward angle. So again, he's always playing with our perception and our expectation around the flatness of these images. Um, and just such a wonderful sense of color too, with how he has painted all of these book spines here as well. So we have this wonderful sense of life in Harlem at this point. But then, of course, there is a war, and Jacob Lawrence is a part of it. We can see him here. He served in the Coast Guard. He was drafted, and he initially served in a racially segregated regiment, and then the only rank available at that time to Black servicemen was a steward's mate. And then eventually he was transferred to the USS Cloud, which was the Coast Guard's first racially integrated vessel. And that's when he began to serve as the ship's artist. Look at how young he still is in these pictures. So he made art during the war. Unfortunately, I think almost all, if not all of it, was lost in demobilization efforts, but then he continued to make works in response to the war following his return home. This is number two in his war series. It's called The Main Control Panel, the nerve center of the ship. This from 1944. And so we can see here this sort of green background. It almost looks like watercolor in some ways. And then he's got all of these ship's dials and instruments, all of these measurement panels that look like just this fabulous geometric abstract composition, right? It almost reminds me of like a Jean-Michel Basquiat picture in so many ways, because he's doing it with this limited color palette and with what seems like a relative sense of freedom too, with like, how quickly it seems like he's dashing off these circles here. We've got our one service member who, taken on the responsibility here of manning the ship's main control panel here. Most of the images from the war series carry a heavy emotional weight. This is a work from 1946 called The Letter. And if you get a letter during a war, it could be a letter that provides comfort, or it could be the last letter you would ever want to read, right? And Jacob Lawrence, I think it's interesting that he chose to depict this picture with express this kind of grief, this kind of sorrow with these big white arms, right? The next time you have a chance, walk up to your dining room table and try to adopt this pose. Brace your arms this way, hang your head, and you will understand that this is the very embodiment of human frailty. This is like absolute devastation. And look at how he's sort of suggesting like the fingers are kind of curling up over here in this one hand. These arms that look like tree trunks, right? It's like it's all kind of coming apart with just that letter in the foreground here. So again, such an emotional impact with really just the human form in a picture like this. I think you get a similar feeling with this next image from the war series. This one's simply called Prayer, but the pose here, the positioning of these human bodies, um, carries so much emotional weight, doesn't it? to be hunched over in this way, to have your arms stretched out along the front of your body this way, to wrap your fingertips around your knees. This isn't a pose that any of us adopt on a normal basis, unless you do a lot of yoga, maybe. Um, but this is like a crumpling, right? Um, this is like supplicating yourself to a higher power in a desperate wish for something to change. Um, we can see the suggestion of waves or maybe mountains in the background. Maybe it's seagrass or regular grass in the foreground, but it's echoing the shape of these bodies as well. They become these huge forms that occupy this landscape. Now, Jacob Lawrence, his time in the Coast Guard took him all around the planet. He went to England, he went to India, he even went to Egypt for some time too. He talked about how when they returned, they were essentially a massive floating hospital with like 5,000 people on this boat. And he said he would never talk about what he saw on that return trip home because he said to do so would cheapen the experience. He gives us some sense of what that was like with this image here that's simply called Going Home. We see all of these bandaged bodies. We see figures that are hunched over. We see the suggestion of like loss of limbs. We see people on crutches. He doesn't make it grotesque, but he makes it serious enough that you stay and you're decoding what we see happening here. So we see that devastation, we see that human toll. Um, the unofficial ending to the war series, I'm making it the official ending, is this scene here. It's To Come Home to Love. This is from 1946 and it's simply called The Lovers. It's such a sweet, intimate scene here, right? With this couple kind of folded into each other, as so many people were doing after the war ended. And it's just these brilliant colors, these strong diagonals. It feels like such a relatable home, and yet at the same time, it's just so glorious in his description, from like the swirling pattern on the couch to like these little doily patterns which exist on the couch back and then over here, kind of hanging off the edge of this table. It's an image that is just so pleasing to the eye and so sweet in its subject that it's like an unmissable Jacob Lawrence. All right, are you ready for something that's a little bit tougher than Lovers? We are going to turn our attention to the Struggle series. The Struggle series happened in the mid 1950s. So Jacob Lawrence has already gone to war. He's come back. He's been hospitalized for nearly a decade. He is thought of by the world really as America's preeminent Black artist, right? So, what is he doing with the Struggle series? He is attempting to tell the story of the American Revolution from a variety of new perspectives. We're not going to see all of them, but he creates images about women in the Revolution, Native Americans, enslaved people, and white people. We're going to glimpse a few of these. He intended for this series to be the same size as the Migration series. He is like aiming high with this one. They're still small panels. He ends up making 30 of them. And here's an installation view that we're looking at. So let's take a look at what the Struggle series looks like. Right off the bat, it feels much more agitated, doesn't it? There is, I mean, for me at least, I look at this and it feels like an uncomfortable energy. This is the first panel in the Struggle series, and the title comes from a Patrick Henry quote. If you know any Patrick Henry quote, it's probably "Give me liberty" or "Give me death." He's an orator. We can see him here in the black over here on the far left, but he uses a different line from Patrick Henry. It's, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery?" So we can see Patrick Henry riling up these colonists who are ready for revolution, right? They're all raising their fists in unity in this moment, and Patrick Henry is like pointing in the direction that they're going to go. And Jacob Lawrence just hints at, just suggests the contradiction here, the hypocrisy in that quote, because Patrick Henry, at the time that he said this, I think owned something like 80 slaves. So that's just suggested with a little bit of red, maybe some blood on that back wall. In this next image, we can see his reimagining of the Boston Massacre. That's an image that I think if any of us have a picture in our head, it probably comes to us by way of good old Paul Revere with the redcoats firing into an unarmed crowd in Boston. Uh, we have Jacob Lawrence focusing on the figure of Crispus Attucks, who was a man who had escaped slavery. And we see him here sort of kneeling and clutching his chest as blood kind of spills out of his body. And he's dying from his wound. He's the first casualty from the Boston Massacre. We don't see the redcoats, but what we do see again is this riling up of people, this agitation, this animation that's happening behind him as the colonists are getting ready to do things like throw rocks in response. Um, so here he is zeroing in on the people whose stories don't often get told. They're not the focus as we think about America's history so often, right? He even retells Washington crossing the Delaware. Most of us know it, of course, through Emanuel Lewitz's famous painting. In his retelling, he uses a quote from one of Washington's aides. And the description for this image is: "We crossed the river at McConkey's Ferry, 9 miles above Trenton. The night was excessively severe, which the men bore without the least murmur." So now we don't know where Washington is. He's certainly not standing triumphantly on any of these boats. It was horrible circumstances. Everybody is is just sort of hanging on for dear life, and they're just sort of grimacing and getting through this. And so Jacob Lawrence shows them all as equals in this boat. One last image from the struggle series that I'm going to share with you is panel number 12. It's called "And a Woman Mans a Cannon." At the left side of the image is this tall standing female figure. This is Margaret Corcoran Corbin, who during a battle in 1776, her husband was manning this cannon. We can see his body here in the foreground. He was killed during this battle. And so here she is with her husband dead before her. She takes over his job at the cannon. So she's manning this cannon. Her contributions to the war effort earned her a military burial at West Point. But Jacob Lawrence is depicting her because for more than 200 years, Margaret Corcoran Corbin was never acknowledged on any sort of war memorial. So again, he's singing the songs, singing the praises of people whose contributions have gone unrecognized. Now, how was this all received? Well, the critics didn't know what to make of this because this wasn't just about the Black experience. That is how they'd sort of pigeonholed Jacob Lawrence. And of course, re examining American history from any other perspective is still like a contentious issue, even in society today. So I can imagine back in the 1950s, people didn't know what to do. There certainly weren't museums who were clamoring to buy this. In the end, it was one buyer who bought all 30 panels and then quickly sold them off sort of one by one. So this series was reassembled, I think back in 2020, in a traveling exhibition. And they maybe couldn't track down a few of them, but they found some in like really unexpected collections where people didn't even realize their Jacob Lawrence painting was a part of a bigger series. So that was an unusual, I would say, sort of blip in his career. We're going to round things off with sort of the end of Jacob Lawrence's career. Now, this is a man who was so celebrated. He had so much success. He did a poster for the Munich Olympics back in 1972. Is this not the most charming image of runners you've ever seen? We sort of have like a fisheye lens here. They're kind of distorted as they're coming around the corner of the track, and they are there's just so much effort and exertion on these faces that are kind of grimacing, and then these wide splits from these runners and these very muscled legs as they're all making this final push towards the finish line here. There's so much energy and vitality and color to an image like this. One of Jacob Lawrence's final works was from 2001. This Murano glass mural was installed in the Times Square subway station in New York City, and it's called New York in Transit. I'm just going to show you a print of part of this image. It's a little bit easier to see. And we can see people who are riding the subway. We can see a carpenter. He loved his builders, right? We can see an image of the city, the builders holding on to like one of those straps in the subway. We can see people talking on the train, people playing outside. And then the next person who's holding on to the strap and the pole here is an artist. It's probably Jacob Lawrence himself with his paintbrushes and his palette. And how perfect is it that the artist who launched himself with the Migration series gets sort of this capstone to his career where once again he's thinking about people in movement here, but now fortunately just on their commute home. I talked about the builders before and how this was an important recurring theme in his body of work. Oftentimes, he shows these very busy, integrated workshops. You oftentimes don't see the result of all of the work, but we see people collaboratively making something together. In fact, these works that he's so well known for. One of them is even in the collection of the White House. I believe it was acquired but I think Laura Bush actually had a hand in the acquisition. This is the installation of the work in the Green Room in 2007. It's another builder's theme. It's another integrated group. She said she loved the symbolism of all of these strong people coming together, building something, working together, making sort of a brighter future for the country, right? And as I understand it, actually, George W. and Laura Bush owned some of their own Jacob Lawrence's as well. And Jacob Lawrence lived such a nice long life that he was able to survive to see his own success. And he was honored in so many ways in the last few years of his life. He received no less than 18 honorary degrees from Yale, from Harvard, from New York University, from Amherst College. This young man who had to drop out of high school to help his family survive is getting honorary degrees from like every major university in the country. Here he is on the right getting the National Medal of Arts, one of the highest recognitions, really, that any artist could achieve. So, after this nice long life, this nice successful career, Jacob Lawrence passed away in 2000 at the age of 82. He continued to paint right up until the final weeks of his life. To go from the corner of the studio that he rented to that attic studio that seemed filled with vitality, with so much color. One of the last things I want to leave you with is that through this window, even though he was living in Seattle at this time, most art historians sort of point to an image of Harlem, essentially, and thinking about how that community had really shaped him, had created this foundation for his life and for his work. Um, we end tonight very quickly with just going back to those main themes that he loved so much. Jacob Lawrence didn't just document American history and Black American history, he gave it visual power and unforgettable form. For 6 decades, he proved that art could be both beautiful and bold, accessible and profound, rooted in specific experience and yet universal in its impact. His legacy lives on in museum collections worldwide, but I think more importantly, It lives on in the conversations that his work still sparks around who gets to tell America's story and whose history deserves to be seen. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. I welcome your questions, your comments, your reactions. I'm going to start looking at the Q&A. Steve says the Van Gogh one on the first few slides of the woman in green reminded me of work by Frida Kahlo. Yeah, Steve, I think that's a great association. I would say that there's kind of a yeah, a visual similarity there too. The shelves in the piece depicting the library in Harlem look like refrigerator shelves containing food for the hungry. Yes, we can tell that you're hungry right now, Steve. Like what my fridge looks like too. Emily says, interesting to me that all the figures in his depression painting were white, and that most or slash all of the black people in his paintings are strong, vibrant, and optimistic. That's an interesting thing to note, Emily. Folks might remember that sort of drab and dreary image of depression from his hospital series. We sort of breezed by it, but I'm going to give us whiplash and go back to it too. Um, Yes, I haven't seen most of the other images from the hospital series. This might just be a reflection on who he actually saw in the hospital with him, less of an attempt to like tell the story of his community. But that's a really good thing to know. And I agree with you because most of his other images are about like the vitality of Black life and community. We definitely don't get that here. Sharon says the migration series depiction of the children working because they couldn't go to school reminds me of Millet's The Gleaners and the heads of the children below the horizon, showing the weight of the land. Sharon, I love that analysis. I love your correlation there. The heaviness of that work, the way their bodies are bent over. I think that's a really great association. Thanks for sharing that. Joe wants to suggest a program for me, Van Gogh. Joe, guess what? I have one. We'll have to do that one soon. Um, Joe says, how did he pass? Well, he died of a gunshot wound, and most people believe it was self-inflicted. I love a good scandal and controversy, so I do love to entertain the idea that maybe it wasn't. Barb says, what kind of art did his wife produce? Off the top of my head, I want to say, you know what? I'm not even going to speculate. I didn't spend that much time looking at his wife's work. I'm really sorry, Barb. But if you wanted to look, her name is Gwendolyn Knight, Knight. If you wanted to get a little bit more familiar with her work, I don't think I'm guessing that it has a more realistic bend. Um, Probably not quite as abstract as her husband's, but somebody feel free to correct me on that. Um, an anonymous attendee says a local art institute had an exhibition about the Haitian uprising of his art. Also, did he do any prints? His paintings can feel like prints. Yes. So there was this Haitian uprising that he depicted in a series very early on in his career, and I wish we could have gone into that because the imagery that he produced for it is so great. It's just limited time, right? Though, thanks for mentioning that. Though maybe that will send people looking for it. And you asked about prints. Yes, he did a lot of printmaking, especially towards the end of his career. Sorry for all of the scrolling, but like this one, the confrontation on the bridge, that's a print. And when we don't really see like the brush strokes or like a variation within like a big block of color, that's when it's a good guess that it's probably a silk screen. Margaret says some of his work reminds me of Romare Bearden. Yeah, there was probably a little bit of cross-pollination there. That's another great association, Margaret. And somebody was asking me the other day, did he have any students? You know, what's the story with that? I think he was such a trailblazer that I think he influenced like just generations of artists, both black and white. So particularly in the Black community, there probably aren't a lot of preeminent Black artists from the 20th century that didn't look very carefully at what Jacob Lawrence had done and what he accomplished. So you're good to bring up Romare Bearden, who I think I'm going to have to do an art talk on at some point. Somebody else said, can you buy prints of his paintings anywhere now? I'm sure you can find something online. I'm not quite sure where I would go to look, but I'm sure it's out there. Absolutely. Victoria says, did Lawrence know Thomas Hart Benton, America Today? It's a really good question. Well, now I'm curious as to why you asked, because I'm wondering if you see like a visual sort of connection between them, the depiction of like city life, maybe. I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't run into anything that would say that, but it was also such a significant work of art that maybe he did. Who knows? Um, Keith asked, will this be streamed? I believe it is being recorded. So our hosting institution, the Chelmsford Public Library, will have that recording. Marcia, thank you so much for your kind words. Margaret is back. She says, the migration painting, a lot of the people leaving the train station had green clothing, almost like a uniform. Yeah, that color is like one of the main colors he uses during that entire series, right? Um, and it's such a subtle color too, but it really kind of like pushes the whole thing along. I love this image right here on the screen on the right, and you can see how he's using it in all of these panels. But yeah, I could see how you could associate that something like that with a uniform. Joe's asking me to promote my upcoming talks. Thanks, Joe. We've got Fierce Females coming up next month. Oh, some lesser known female artists, but certainly a few favorites in there as well. I've been having a lot of fun putting that together. We've got Kara Walker, we've got Angelica Kaufman, we've got Alice Neal, we have so many. I think there's going to be 8 total, which means we'll just have a short time with each of them, but it will be a blast. So that will be at the end of next month. Emily says, I can't remember the name of the series that was on display at the PM, but there was a missing painting. That was the Struggle series. In the publicity about the show, one of the missing paintings was located. Yes, I think there was like a nurse in New York City who was just kind of like, oh, I think my painting is part of that series. And I love it when things like that happen because I think it renews this little faith that I have that maybe there's just a masterpiece kicking around my house too. I think we got through all of the Q&A. I'm gonna turn my attention to the chat just in case there's anything in there too. Um, Thank you, thank you, thank you for the very kind words, everybody. I really appreciate it. Oh, Sarah made a nice observation here. The bold geometric shapes he uses makes me think of interpreting them in quilts. Sarah, if you do that, I would love to see it. Make sure you send me an email. Um, and Lynn, I'm glad that the story of Jacob Lawrence and his work really resonated with you. Um, and Nancy Parker, I'm so glad you're here tonight. Thanks for your kind words. It's always great to see these familiar names. I just love this little arts loving community that we have. Um, let's see here. Oh, Carol says she saw a retrospective of his work about 10 years ago. Jacqueline says, according to a New York Times article in Wikipedia, Lawrence continued to paint until a few weeks before his death. Yes, in the year 2000. Um, Does the migration series ever go on loan to other museums? That's a good question, Sue. Well, let's see, who was it who just said that they'd seen a retrospective? I would imagine that some of those might have included works from the migration series. Oh, and Margaret says Etsy has prints. um, all right, I think we got to just about everything. Again, everybody, thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening with me, for getting to know Jacob Lawrence a little bit better. I feel like we're all better people for it, right? I mean, his work is just so powerful, so impactful. So thank you, everybody. I'm looking forward to next month. We'll have a blast with some fierce females, okay? Have a great night, everybody.